After the success of the first Etrian Odyssey, it was only natural that Atlus would want to follow it up with a sequel soon after. The dungeon crawlers that it styled itself after were also mostly remembered as trilogies, so to continue making at least 2 more dungeon crawlers in that style made sense. But instead of making a straightforward sequel that feels like another individual campaign built on the same rule set, they got a little bit more ambitious. Despite this, Etrian Odyssey 2 isn't anywhere near as celebrated as the other 2 games on the Nintendo DS, and the original DS release tends to get glossed over in images recommending the series to new players. It's easy to see that and expect a lot to have gone wrong. But has anything really gone wrong though? Let's dive into the labyrinth once more and find out what's different this time. Etrian Odyssey 2 presents us with a massive tower leading upwards with legends speaking of an ancient castle in the sky, housing eternal rewards for those who manage to get to the top. Of course, nobody's ever made it all the way to the top before, and although the town built around the entrance to the dungeon has grown thanks to the adventurers seeking to strike it rich, most of the townsfolk trying to make an honest day's living have seen enough adventurers stumble into it and fail to make it past the first floor. So the first trial given to any party by the Council of High Lagarde is a baptism by fire. Instead of being given the task to map out the first floor while a guard blocks the way forward, a guard drags you into the middle of the forest and tells you to use your map to find the way back to town. And if you can't, well, that's not their problem. They won't recognize anyone as a citizen until they've successfully cleared this first trial. If anything happens to a group that isn't strong enough to perform this simple task, well, they're not worth worrying about. So before adventurers are allowed to explore the dungeon, they have to avoid becoming another statistic. And there's a good reason for this. The dungeon isn't just explored for the sake of it this time around. There's some level of urgency as the council desperately believes in the legend of the treasure at the top, hoping that it can save them. Etrian Odyssey 2 is a game with a lot of story considerations like this, much more than the first game. A lot of the setting feels more fleshed out in a way that makes a lot of sense. Meanwhile, the dungeon itself has become a lot harsher, especially if you've entered the password given at the end of the first game. And if it's a solid party the people of High Lagarde want, then it's a solid party they are going to get. This time around, we've got the Hanagumi from Sakura Taisen on the Sega Saturn. With Sakura Shinguchi as a Ronin, a class that fulfills a similar role to the Landsknecht in Etrian Odyssey 2, but with the option to forsake defenses for higher damage output. Midareba giving a triple slash to a single target doing enough damage to take down most standard enemies in the game in a single hit. Sumire Kanzaki as a Dark Hunter, using her whip to give out poison damage. Baiting out counters for any damage coming into the first row, and even straight up erasing FOEs from the battlefield. Iris Chateaubrand being a war magus almost sounds like a joke, but she was the closest that I got to having a healer, so it does kind of work. Though her main strength ended up being her cut abilities, dealing high unexpected damage to enemies inflicted by a status effect. And enemies would definitely have a status effect on them, with Lee Koran as a hexer. Torpor, a cheap sleep spell with ridiculously high chances of success that hits all enemies, carried the party for most of the game, and that's not even getting into the abilities like Frailty or Dampen lowering defenses and elemental resistances. The big reason a lot of people go for Hexers is because of Revenge, an ability that feels broken with how it works. Dealing damage to enemies based on missing health, ignoring both defense and elemental resistance in its calculations. But I didn't have too much use for this in my lineup where Sleep and Poison already gave me a similar effect on my War Mages with a little extra setup through extra party members. And finally, Maria Tachibana as a Gunner, capable of clearing all negative status ailments to the entire party in one turn and dealing elemental damage. Also being able to fire multiple regular hits on random targets. Often being the last to act, but with the ability to clear status effects, and some bosses and FOEs love throwing those out on turn 1, so being slow is a good thing. Her low action speed also means she definitely hits after the Hexer's debuffs get cast as well. Ronin, Dark Hunter, War Mages, Gunner, Hexer is kind of a boilerplate party lineup for Etrian Odyssey 2, but it is one that fits the character theme that I wanted to get away with, while also showcasing the biggest difference in combat between Etrian Odyssey 1 and 2. You might have noticed that there's no traditional tank or healer in this lineup, and there's a reason for that, but we'll get into that later. First, let's take our first step into the dungeon. As soon as you get into the dungeon, there's a few things that immediately stand out if you played the first game. First off, objects are a lot more 3D now. All the walls in the dungeon feel like they have more layers of depth to them, so the dungeon walls feel like there's more to them than just a bunch of wallpaper. This is an important distinction since the walls really are 3D now, and there's plenty of tiles with impassable debris. You can't walk past this debris, but you can see beyond it, giving a glimpse at things further into the floor, or a better view of the FOEs in the area. We'll get to those guys soon enough, we're not ready for that talk yet. The second major change is that you can sidestep now. You don't have to fully turn around every time you want to go around a corner or need to move one space to the side anymore. It's a minor change, but it makes walking through areas so much nicer now that it's here. The third change, and as far as I know, this one is exclusive to Etrian Odyssey 2 in particular, is that you're going up, not down. It's a minor thing, but it takes some getting used to when mapping out areas. For the most part, it doesn't really change anything about how the maps flow, outside of the direction that you're falling into on the few floors that have pitfalls on them. The floor layouts in general are a huge improvement over the first games. A lot of areas feel a lot less tedious to navigate, and they don't go too hard on looping you through some of the same paths with shortcuts collapsing in on themselves. It definitely helps that the mapping tools are up to par with what the floor designs are asking you to draw now. The mapping tools are what got the biggest upgrade of anything in this entry in my opinion. The fact that you can actually map things accurately this time should not be such a major point, but Etrian Odyssey 1 set the bar low enough for this to be important to talk about. You can now accurately mark damage tiles, one-way shortcuts in hallways. They even give you 3 different gathering spot markers. So there's no need to awkwardly mark damage tiles with event markers anymore. You can actually just put different colored tiles on the floor. Though the gathering spot markers are the one thing that could have been done better, Etrian Odyssey 2 gives you 3 different colored gathering markers that look identical with the map zoomed out. If only they gave you 3 actually different icons. It would be a much cleaner way of distinguishing the 3 gathering points at a glance, but who knows what the future will bring. All in all, mapping areas is a lot nicer now. No more obstacles you can't reasonably map out. And no more object limitations that stop you from placing enough markers for the actual amount of obstacles on a floor. Spent long enough in the dungeon and your encounter orb will slowly turn red, and as soon as it's red, a random encounter is about to start any step now. Which means it's time to actually talk about combat. Combat in Etrian Odyssey 2 is interesting. It's not bad by any means, but it feels like a lot of the changes made between the 2 games in general feels reactionary. Like they based everything they changed on the response to the first title, and the combat is where you really see how far they took this. Like I mentioned before, my party lineup didn't have a traditional healer or a tank, and that's why. In Etrian Odyssey 1, Immunize and Defender protected the entire party from all incoming damage. It wasn't just strong, it was pretty much busted, especially when you also consider the amount of TP and HP restorative passive abilities. Or spells like Relaxing that help keep you in the dungeon for much longer. In Etrian Odyssey 2, strategies like that got hit with the nerf stick pretty hard. Same with the Landsknecht's All-Slash. The first game was heavily focused towards being defensive to a point you didn't have to worry about incoming damage that much. And the second game is all about hitting hard and fast before the enemies can do the same to you. Most encounters in the entire game are going to either kill or be killed by you within 2 or 3 turns. Everyone gets to be a paper tiger in their own way. TP feels a lot more limiting too, so post-battle healing through spells won't tide you over as long as it used to. Because of that, a lot of late game fights can end up still feeling like early game fights, with either your side or the enemy's side dying really fast. Despite your options growing over time, the combat rarely evolves or goes on for long enough to feel like it's gotten deeper than it was at the start of the game, and this includes boss fights and FOEs. The biggest problem is that there aren't too many abilities that help you sustain your party for longer periods of time in the dungeon. And there being no healing points within the dungeon, only these temporary checkpoints that let you warp back to them from town. So you still need a warp wire to go to town, but once in town, you can warp back to a checkpoint instead of the start of the stratum. In Etrian Odyssey 1, your journeys into the dungeon slowly started taking longer as you made progress. You start seeing the day and night cycle take place more often later into the game, giving this feeling that you're becoming stronger, you're acclimating to the dangers of a hostile environment, becoming more capable of staying in the dungeon for a longer period of time. Compared to when you were a rookie and managed to stay inside of the dungeon for 3 hours at a time before rushing back to rest. Etrian Odyssey 2 doesn't really give you any of that. It's a weird change because Etrian Odyssey 2 also has floor layouts that specifically want you to travel at night. Sometimes even making stronger FOEs only move during the night while staying still and blocking passageways like a Snorlax during the day. But you pretty much have to stay at the town's inn until nightfall to see the areas at night, since the game wasn't balanced with longer treks in mind. And since your time within the dungeon is often shorter than it used to be, you also don't get to use the newly reworked boost meter as often. In Etrian Odyssey 1, when that meter was full, you could perform one regular action with a power boost behind it. In Etrian Odyssey 2, it's more of a limit break, giving you an extra powerful class ability for your party members. Unfortunately, they take forever to build up in a game with much shorter dungeon crawls, which is a shame because these abilities are a lot more useful than the old boost system was. You just never get to use it. The shorter trips and the lack of healing locations also means that when it's time to start grinding, you're looking at a lot of trips back to town to recover, slowing the pace of the grind down even more. If there's one moment you don't want the pacing to go any slower, it's when you need to grind. So it can feel very frustrating coming out of Etrian Odyssey 1, where you have those healing spots that allow you to stay in the dungeon and just keep fighting until your inventory is full. At the very least, skill menus are a lot easier to read this time around. You can immediately see what other skill ranks are required to learn a new one while hovering over them in a menu, so you don't have to select them one by one to figure out when you get to learn what. On top of that, not all skills go to a maximum level of 10 anymore. Plenty of skills only need 5 skill points to max out, and the general rule of either putting a single point or maxing it out entirely is still a thing here. So with several skills requiring less points in general, it's easier to max out multiple skills now. That's one of the things I really like about the Gunner. If you want to max out any particular bread and butter attack you want to focus on for your playthrough, it won't take too long until you've hit it, and you've got plenty of skill points left to still put into other skills after. Gunners never feel too boxed into any particular build, making them incredibly versatile for a class that specializes in a single weapon type. The dungeon itself also has more events across all the floors, and those events no longer exclusively happen to the party leader. In the previous game, it felt like events kind of stopped existing after the first 3 floors, but Etrian Odyssey 2 keeps them coming all the way to the end. It helps give some character to your team while also making the dungeon itself feel a little bit more alive too. The events are also what led to the second biggest meme in Etrian Odyssey since the appearance of deer: squirrels. Squirrels who steal your goddamn warp wire. Squirrels are the worst rodent out there, don't trust them, they're rats with good PR. The dungeon in general feels much richer than it did before. Some of that comes down to those impassable barriers you can see past while exploring. Being able to see a part of the dungeon that you don't have access to yet gives you a better sense that things are connected, much more so than only being able to verify distances on your map. And Etrian Odyssey 2 makes good use of this visual change, expecting you to map ahead of where you can walk, so you know what direction you're supposed to be moving towards as you make your way through the dungeon. You know where a future item box or the exit leading to the next floor is. As you explore more of the map, you'll have a better sense of how to get there, instead of blindly stumbling around in the dark. The mapping tutorial already spells this out for players early on. You know what direction the town is in, you just have to make your way towards it. This way of doing the tutorial also means that you can rush towards that general direction to get to the real game faster. My favorite part of mapping Etrian Odyssey 2 though is the ice floors. I usually feel ice floor puzzles in games are pretty lame because they're not much of a puzzle. You can see the entire floor from a top-down perspective, so there isn't much you have to figure out to get to the other side. Though when Etrian Odyssey 2 does it, it's all in first person, limiting your view dramatically. The ice also stretches much further than you can see, and you're expected to map out everything you can see while you're sliding from one end to the other. So when you finally reach a point that connects to an exit, you'll know how to take it instead of accidentally setting yourself back. It's the exact kind of puzzle that works very well with the mapping tools that Etrian Odyssey is built around, and I'm glad that the inclusion of a winter area let them go with this kind of floor mechanic. The idea of having the areas of the dungeon reflect a season was a nice touch too. Starting off with spring, then leading into fall, winter, summer, and Pokemon Heart Gold is a very good framework for themed floors. The first game had themed floors as well, going from a grove to a jungle to a rainforest, then a barrens before the final area, each area being less inhabitable than the last. But when 3 of those areas in a row can just be read as forest, it's a bit easy to lose track of the implications until you randomly reach sand. And I hate the sand. It's coarse and rough to map. Oh, look at that. It's time. It's time. It's FOE time. FOEs in Etrian Odyssey 2 are weird. For one, they come in different colors, each signifying a different trait, like being able to fly over small barriers, only moving for specific reasons, having a normal pattern, or even being invisible on the minimap. It's a good concept, but it feels like there are too many colors and not enough times they get put to use. FOEs are kind of a mixed bag in general in this game. Their positioning and use makes them act like they're a navigational puzzle, where you have to figure out the pattern behind them to advance without fighting them most of the time. But then most FOEs feel less threatening than they did in the previous entry, especially when there's an ability that exists to just remove them from combat. With the Dark Hunter's climax maxed out, they can instantly kill enemies at about half HP. There's no chance percentages or dice rolls or anything involved. The ability only checks for health and whether or not instant kills are allowed, which they are for FOEs. And with most enemies dying in a single turn, FOEs are the one enemy type that takes a long time to take down. So to offset the lack of danger for most FOEs, they instead make it not worth it to fight them in a different way. FOEs don't give you experience points, making continued combat against them not worth the TP it costs to fight them, which is a very odd move. All it does is slow the experience point gain down since you can't FOE hunt when you're ready to tackle them. It would have been nice if there were alternative added ways to gain experience in its place, but unfortunately, all you can do is grind out random encounters and redo boss fights whenever those respawn. This makes the late game especially sluggish, since there's so little combat variation when trying to gain a few levels before the next big boss fight. There's also the issue that in several areas it can be pretty hard to see what movement patterns FOEs have. Sometimes they pack so many into a single room that you end up with too many FOEs on the screen to track properly. The puffballs don't give much details regarding directional intent, and often enough you don't get to track all of them on the bottom screen. Some of this feels like it could have been avoided by giving you a better entrance to some of the rooms that those FOEs are in, so it's easier to see their movement in isolation. In one of these rooms, I only started to figure out the pattern after killing one of the FOEs, because just taking one of them out of the picture made tracking their movement that much easier to read. It's a bit of a mess, although I do appreciate the idea behind it. Stressing FOEs as something you don't want to cross and forcing you to sneak past groups of them to survive in a hostile environment? The first game did this too, and I think the floor designs in the second game are much better suited for this, but it doesn't quite work as intended a lot of the time. The abilities and items that you get to lure or freeze them are a cool idea though. And I do like that they tried to make the deer FOE a fearsome animal within the story, but more could be done here. Multicolored FOE puffballs, the way that they appear here, wouldn't see a return to the series in the future, not even in the remake. They had their one chance and they blew themselves. And I feel like some of the EXP gain issues would have been less of a problem if they'd reworked another aspect of the game. And that's one where I have a similar problem of liking the idea but not the execution here. Etrian Odyssey 2 still has quests, functioning pretty much the way that they did in Etrian Odyssey 1, though this time, the flavor text does a much better job of bringing the town alive through the short stories of people living there. The main problem here is that most of the quests just don't feel worthwhile. They give some pretty lame rewards. The rewards could have remained the same while giving some experience points to make you want to do them, but as it stands, the majority just don't feel like they're worth the effort. Though, it is neat that they're trying to tie them together with larger quest lines, as well as content unlocks with secret areas opening up as you've taken quests related to them. These are things that I can get behind. There's even a quest line to open up the post-game area with some additional setup, something that I think is exclusive to Etrian Odyssey 2 and not revisited with later entries. It gives the post-game content some more mystique and build-up before you get to it, which I can really appreciate. The main quest-giving NPC is also a very cool dude who has seen adventurers come and go, presumably to their deaths. He doesn't really give a shit anymore, not in a mean-spirited way or anything, but he is a bit blunt about things. He has a tendency to not even listen to some of the townsfolk and what they want adventurers to do for them, accepting their requests blindly because he's sure someone will step up and take the quest either way. I like him. There's one more issue that I have with the town though. Although I like that they rolled up the healing items into the weapon shop item listings are way too big, with too little sorting options. The deeper into the game you go, the more scrolling you need to do to get to the relevant weapons that you want to buy, since the categories themselves don't go much deeper than just weapons, armor, and accessories. It's not great, especially not with how many different types of weapons there are. What is great though, is the music. As always, all the tracks in the game are by Yuzo Koshiro, originally created on a PC-88 before adapting the tracks for the Nintendo DS. One thing I didn't get around to bringing up in the last video though, and it's a very Yuzo Koshiro thing to do, is the song titles. We could have easily ended up with song titles named after areas, or with simple names like Field 1, Battle 2, or Boss Theme. Instead, we get treated to titles like Guardians of the Sorrowful Ice, Vast Lands Spreading North, A Sudden Gust of Wind That Calls for Death, This is very much a Yuzo Koshiro thing, since the titles have very similar names to a lot of the old Ys Book 1 and 2 song titles, like First Step Towards Wars or To Make the End of Battle. But it's a nice thing to see him keeping up with that and doing it for pretty much the entire franchise. Etrian Odyssey 2 is a strange game. There's a lot of great quality of life changes, and some pretty aggressive knee-jerk reactionary balancing. The series changed directors between the two games, and even then, there was only a single year between the two releases. For a game made within a single year by a new director, it's extremely ambitious. But with where the series was headed after this, I can imagine that to a lot of people the changes don't feel quite enough of a departure, and it doesn't help that some of the balancing in Etrian Odyssey 2 can feel outright broken, for good and bad. As one of my friends would say, Etrian Odyssey 2's balancing makes it a beautiful disaster, It's a great game for people who like exploring game meta and theory crafting weird and wonderful builds and compositions, something that is definitely a strength in most of the series. And having builds that rely on one another as a synergy started here, with the War Mages towards the Hexer, definitely making it feel like the first hint at the kind of party dynamic that had become a mainstay shortly after. So, do I recommend Etrian Odyssey 2? That's a difficult question to answer. If you're intending to play the series in order of release, then you should definitely play it after the first game. There's no reason to skip Etrian Odyssey 2. But it's not a great entry point on its own, nor is it the best one of the 3 titles released on the Nintendo DS. If, for whatever reason, Etrian Odyssey 2 is the only entry that you have access to, then sure enough, you can start there. Give it a shot, otherwise, most of the other entries in the franchise, except Nexus, would be a better starting point. Now, that does leave us with Untold 2. I haven't had any past experiences with that one yet, and I figured it would be better to leave it for later. As we'll see the series grow and new features get added, it'd make more sense to look at Untold 2 when we get to the 3DS titles, especially when the second Untold's additions and changes are much more substantial than the first Untold's changes. For now, the next Etrian Odyssey will be one of the main reasons I wanted to cover this series, and an entry a lot of people have as their favorite. Though I think the second part could be said for almost every entry moving forward. But if Etrian Odyssey 1 was the franchise coming to life, and Etrian Odyssey 2 was a new director finding his footing with it, then Etrian Odyssey 3 is it moving forward, and boy did it. Speaking of doing it, I asked people on Patreon an important question. In a situation where both are perfectly viable in their own way, do you prefer to spec offensively or defensively? Almost everyone chose to go for the offensive build, and I get it, I'm pretty much the same too. The only time I really built for sustainability or defense was in the early days of Path of Exile, back when lag and desync were the game's main obstacles to overcome. Otherwise, I tend to not really be much of a tanky player. I don't really go big armor or health in Soulsborne games even, and I'm always shocked to see people usually having over 3 times my health in them when they share screenshots. Which is not me bragging or anything, I eat shit because of the lack of health often enough. If anything, building evenly is the smartest choice. I just like high risk, high damage combat. It's fun. Anyway, I probably sound drastically different in this video. I haven't listened back yet, but my throat is just really bad right now. I can barely talk, so I've been forcing myself to read this script because I want this video out already, and I don't want to wait any longer. At the same time, I have a new microphone. I upgraded from a Blue Yeti to a AT2020 that's hooked into a preamp that's hooked into an interface, instead of just a USB device. So hopefully next video you guys get to hear the new normal, but for now, I don't sound good. As always, this video has been brought to you by people who are supporting the channel on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now and vote in future polls, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp and I will see ya.